Hello and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good morning and welcome to the most comprehensive Hindu analysis on YouTube. So today in the Hindu newspaper we have plenty of important articles. I have chosen 12 articles for a detailed and comprehensive analysis so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. So before we start, I have a very important announcement. Starting from today, we will be conducting a series of special classes on the Unacademy app. You will get to attend lectures from your favorite educators on the 18th, 19th, and 20th of September from 8 a.m. in the morning till 10 p.m. in the night. Let me show you the detailed schedule. Mukesh sir would be taking few special classes for geography. Me and Aastha ma'am would also be taking up few strategy and current affairs sessions. And we also have sessions lined up from Shyam sir, Sarmad sir, and Abhishek sir. So those interested, click on the link provided in the description and ensure you catch these sessions and get to experience the online classes of Unacademy. And if you want the PDF of the Hindu analysis, please scan the QR code on your screen and join our official Telegram channel. After the session ends, we will be sharing the PDF over here. So let's get started and look at the first article. On page number 8 and 6, we have two related articles which is connected to the Waqf Amendment Bill. Recently, the Parliament has enacted the Waqf Amendment Act. It was notified in April 2025 as well. But some of the provisions were very controversial and petitions had been filed at the Supreme Court challenging the constitutionality of the Amendment Act itself. And just few days ago, on 15 September, the Supreme Court bench, headed by Chief Justice of India B.R. Gavai, has passed an interim judgment. In this interim judgment, the Supreme Court has as of now refused to comment on the constitutionality of the law. It has presumed the law to be constitutional given that it has been enacted by the Parliament. So a final verdict is still awaited, but in the interim judgment, the Supreme Court has put a stay on some of the provisions and it has upheld a few other provisions. Now, this is a very important development. This interim ruling of the Supreme Court, where few provisions have been stayed by the Supreme Court, its implementation has been put on hold, and few provisions have been upheld. And eventually, the Supreme Court will deliver a final verdict whether the Amendment Act was constitutional or not. So let's break down this topic and go beyond this article. Let's understand all the details as this topic can be very, very important and it brings up some important constitutional issues as well. But to begin with, let's first understand what is a Waqf. Many of you may not be familiar with this particular provision. See, in classical Islamic jurisprudence under the Sharia, Waqf property or Waqf land, which is essentially administered as per the religious codes, it is seen as part of Muslim endowment, where properties are essentially donated in the name of God. Such a property can be used for religious activities and religious purposes, for charitable, philanthropic activities as well. So such property, which is designated as Waqf property under the Sharia, is inalienable. Meaning such land cannot be sold. It can't be inherited by someone. Once an individual, let's say a practicing Muslim, has donated his personal property as Waqf property, this property can be used by the concerned Waqf boards only for religious and charitable purposes to serve the interests of the larger community. It cannot be used as The private property of anyone, it is inalienable. It is seen as God's own property. It can't be transferred to someone. It can't be sold. It can't be leased or rented out. So it is meant to serve only the purposes of the community members for charitable, philanthropic activities. Could be to set up an educational institution or to run a NGO or to carry out religious activities. So such land is recognized under classical Islamic jurisprudence as Waqf property. And this is legally recognized. In India, we have the Waqf Act of 1995 that provides statutory recognition in line with the constitutional protection which is granted to religious groups and religious minorities in India. So there's not only a statutory right for such Waqf property, but this flows from the constitutional rights, the fundamental rights which are granted in the Constitution when it comes to practicing, professing one's religion, the freedom to practice, profess any religion, and as well as to protect the rights of religious minorities. Now, if you look at Article 26 of the Indian Constitution, Article 26 provides the freedom to manage one's religious affairs. This includes the fundamental right to establish and maintain institutions for religious and charitable purposes. It's under this specific provision that Waqf property would fall under. Now, this applies equally for all religions, where religious communities have the right not only to practice, profess, and propagate the religion, but even to establish, maintain institutions for religious and charitable purposes. If you look at Article 30, that provides rights for minorities, religious and linguistic minorities, it essentially grants a fundamental right to establish educational institutions to protect and promote the rights of religious and linguistic minorities. So, under these provisions, Waqf land has constitutional legitimacy and it has been provided legal recognition through the Waqf Act. Now, to manage this property, to recognize them and essentially to register them, to regulate them, essentially there is a council and a board at the central and state level. At the center, we have the Central Waqf Council, which comes under the Ministry of Minority Affairs. Please take note of these facts, which can be very important for your prelims. The Central Waqf Council, which comes under the Ministry of Minority Affairs, it consists of around 22 members. And at the state level, the law provides for state Waqf boards consisting of 11 members. And it falls under the respective state government's minority welfare department. So this is the institution through which Waqf properties are regulated. But however, there is a lot of controversy surrounding Waqf land and Waqf property and the endowment which is donated out on religious grounds or charitable grounds. Now let's see why this Amendment Act had to be brought out by the Parliament, why the government was pushing for it, what's the controversy surrounding this, and what has the Supreme Court said about some of the provisions. I will take you through some specific provisions. I'll tell you whether the Supreme Court has upheld the provision or it has put a stay on this provision. So let's break this down. Let's understand by starting with this important provision which was added through the Amendment Act. The Amendment Act provided that Waqf property which is being donated by a donor, there is a condition, a criteria should be met. The donor should be a practicing Muslim for a minimum of 5 years. If, let's say, someone is donating land for the Waqf board, for Waqf activities, for religious charitable activities, if that land has to be treated as inalienable, as the property of God himself, for this to be legitimized, the new criteria was the donor should be a practicing Muslim for 5 years. Or else, any such land donation or endowment will not be treated as Waqf property. It will not enjoy that protection, the legal constitutional protection. Now, why did the government bring in such a provision? The government had a legitimate aim, a legitimate concern. Because there have been several instances where people of other religion, let's say a Hindu or a Christian, maybe uh, they have failed to repay the loans on the property that they are owning. So at the last minute, instead of essentially allowing the banks to take over the property, what they do is they convert their faith, they convert their religion, they convert to Islam, which is a this is a fraudulent practice essentially, and they try to donate this land as a Waqf property. Such fraudulent instances have been noticed, where in the name of religion, right, people of other faith who are defaulting on their loans, they end up converting to Islam, and as if they are donating this land to the Waqf board, they try to convert this so that the banks cannot touch the property. Now, don't you think this is a misuse of religious faith and practices? Don't you think this is a misuse of the legal constitutional provisions that exist? The government has a legitimate right to regulate this. But however, there is a counter argument. Because see, this is a controversial topic and we will be unbiased in our discussion. We will look at both the perspectives. We will look at the perspective of the government and those who are pushing for these changes and those who are opposed to it. And we will see what the Supreme Court has said. Now, those who have opposed such a provision, they argue that if you're basically empowering a government officer to decide whether the donor is a practicing Muslim or not for 5 years, then aren't you interfering directly in someone's personal religious affairs? More importantly, how will you exactly verify if a person is a practicing Muslim for 5 years? Is there a process? Is there a procedure for that? Now, this can't be objectively verified. This will become subjective. So eventually, the officer responsible, who would be the DC, the district collector, would essentially apply his or her subjectivity to determine whether the donor was a practicing Muslim or not. More importantly, how should it matter? Whether you are a Muslim from birth or you converted recently, and if you're donating your property, your personal private property to Waqf purposes, why should the state inquire whether you're a practicing Muslim for 5 years? And who decides upon this criteria? Why 5 years? Why can't it be 2 years or 10 years? Why is it this so arbitrary? This was a valid question raised by the litigants as well. And the Supreme Court has agreed with the litigants. The Supreme Court has put a stay on this controversial provision. There are two grounds on which the Supreme Court has stayed this provision. One, state cannot interfere in your personal religious matter. Whether you're practicing your faith or not, for how many years are you practicing it, that should not be the concern of the state. The state has no business to get involved in that. And also, the criteria is absolutely arbitrary. So, on these grounds, the Supreme Court has stayed the implementation of this controversial provision. Coming to the next point, the Amendment Act allowed the district collector to act as the adjudicator in case of property disputes related to Waqf property. The DC was being empowered by the Amendment Act to act as the adjudicator to decide upon property disputes which will come up, because there is a legitimate government interest here as well, because there have been many instances where Waqf property has led to encroachment of government land. In the name of Waqf property, several large tracts of government land have been encroached. There are many instances of this happening. This is again a misuse of faith, a misuse of religious customs and practices, a misuse of existing law. Hundreds of acres and thousands of hectares of government land has been encroached upon and taken over as Waqf property to serve the interests of certain corrupt members. So why shouldn't the government regulate this? Why shouldn't the government step in and prevent this from happening? So government definitely has a legitimate aim to prevent the encroachment of government land and its takeover as Waqf property. That's why the government believed that there should be a regulation over here, and the DC will decide when such disputes will come up. And according to this Amendment Act, the moment the inquiry begins, if the DC of a district begins an inquiry whether this Waqf property was encroached essentially from government land. The moment the inquiry starts, the Waqf status is lost. This is what the government had pushed for, and this was enacted by the parliament as well. The moment the inquiry begins by the district collector, that particular property in question will lose its Waqf status, the protection will be lost. So there was a lot of opposition against this controversial provision, and the Supreme Court has intervened here as well. The Supreme Court has no problem with government regulating the misuse of such provisions and the encroachment of government land. Supreme Court has recognized that this is a legitimate state purpose. But however, Supreme Court has a problem with the DC being given this authority. Now you tell me, when it comes to property disputes, who has the jurisdiction to decide upon property disputes? Any idea? Have you ever dealt with a property dispute in your family, in your community? Property disputes come under the jurisdiction of civil courts. Or in case of tribunals, they exercise the jurisdiction. The judiciary essentially has the jurisdiction. Now, why is the government giving this role to itself, to the executive? Isn't this a violation of doctrine of separation of powers? So on this ground, the Supreme Court has stayed this controversial provision as well. If let's say for example, these corrupt instances have occurred where Waqf property essentially is basically built upon government land which has been encroached. Now this matter should be decided by the civil court, by the concerned tribunals. Why is the government giving this power to itself? The DC is part of the executive and the DC can't be vested with this authority. This is a classic violation of doctrine of separation of powers. That's why the Supreme Court has put its foot down and it has stated this provision that you cannot give this authority to the DC. This is a matter to be decided by the civil courts under the concerned jurisdiction. Understood? So this is the other important point you need to note down. Next, the government was pushing for more transparency, more accountability with regard to the Central Waqf Council and the State Waqf Boards. So in this regard, the Amendment Act has tried to change the composition of these boards. I told you earlier that the Central Waqf Council under the Ministry of Minority Affairs consists of 22 members with a CEO, a Chief Executive Officer. Now, previously, the CEO would always be a Muslim, obviously, because Waqf issues are essentially connected to religion and faith. So invariably, the CEO would be a Muslim and majority composition in the Waqf Council would also be Muslim members. Same with state Waqf boards as well. But through the Amendment Act, the government has tried to change this. To bring in transparency and accountability, the government pushed for changes in the composition of the Waqf Council and the Waqf boards. Now, if this law had taken full effect, in the Central Waqf Council, up to potentially 12 members could be non-Muslims. Even the CEO could be a non-Muslim appointed by the government. Then at the state Waqf boards, you usually have 11 members in total, including the CEO. The government was pushing for at least 7 non-Muslim members. This had triggered a lot of outrage. Now, isn't this interference of the state in minority religious affairs? Doesn't this represent a threat to a minority religion? Why should non-Muslim members be given higher preference in the composition of these important bodies? So this was raised by the litigants and the opposition, and the Supreme Court has stayed this provision. Essentially, it has put a cap. It has capped the number of non-Muslim members who will be included in the Waqf Council and the Waqf boards. Instead of up to 12 potential non-Muslim members, now according to the latest Supreme Court ruling, only 4 of them can be non-Muslim members in the Central Waqf Council. And only 3 of them can be non-Muslim members in the State Waqf Board. And the Supreme Court has also directed that as far as possible, as much as possible, the CEO should be a Muslim. So it's not mandated the CEO should be a Muslim, but as much as possible, the government should ensure the CEO is a Muslim. So this is where the Supreme Court has essentially tweaked the amendment. It has capped the number of non-Muslim members to protect religious minority rights, to prevent the state from interfering with religious affairs, and ensure that religious rights are guaranteed. So this is another important change. The Supreme Court has essentially not withheld the provision entirely or struck it down. It has not upheld it either. Instead, it has tweaked the provision, placing a cap on the number of non-Muslim members in the Central Waqf Council and the state Waqf boards. Now look at the next one. Another key provision which had been pushed through the Amendment Act was that in the name of Waqf property, tribal land and protected monuments cannot be encroached. Now, this is very crucial, and the Supreme Court has upheld this provision, meaning it has ruled in favor of the government. As you can see, it's a very balanced interim judgment. The Supreme Court has not blindly sided with the government, nor has it blindly sided with the litigants. It has walked the tightrope, struck a fine balance, and the final judgment is still awaited. Now, see, please understand, in India, we have a law, the Ancient Monuments Act, under which monuments of national importance, they have a degree of protection. And if it has any religious value, concerned religious community can continue their religious practices. Now, let's say there is a mosque or a temple or a church which is of historical significance. And the law not only provides for the protection of the monument, but at the same time, it allows the religious community to continue their practice. They can even carry out their worship, their rituals and customs. This is permitted under law, but protected monuments cannot be taken over as Waqf property. That is something which threatens the cultural heritage of India. So that's why this amendment was seen as a legitimate amendment, where the state has to protect these national monuments and it can't be taken away in the name of Waqf property by the Waqf boards and the council. So in this regard, the Supreme Court has upheld this amendment. Same goes for tribal land. Tribal land can't be donated away as Waqf property because tribal communities, scheduled tribes in India, enjoy constitutional protection for their land. Land is inalienable with regard to tribal rights. So Supreme Court has upheld this amendment that tribal land can't be converted into Waqf property. This provision, which was part of the Amendment Act, has been upheld by the Supreme Court. So in this case, Supreme Court has sided with the government. On the other provisions which we discussed, Supreme Court has either sided with the litigants or it has taken a balanced approach and it has tweaked the provisions. So this again establishes how the Supreme Court has been striking that balance on a very controversial topic. On one hand, protecting the rights of a minority community. On the other hand, promoting the right of the government, the responsibility of the government to regulate these matters and these affairs. Now, in this particular case, there's one very important doctrine which the Supreme Court spoke about. The doctrine of presumed constitutionality of laws. What do you mean by this? Now, you take the Waqf Amendment Act. Okay, the constitutionality of this was challenged by the litigants. The litigants were arguing that this Amendment Act is unconstitutional. It goes against fundamental rights. But what did the Supreme Court say? The Supreme Court has said, we are going to presume the law to be constitutional as of now. Why? Because the law has been passed by the Parliament. So unless and until the Supreme Court finds otherwise, to strike down the law as unconstitutional, the law shall be presumed to be constitutional because it has been passed by the Parliament by following the established process in the Constitution. This is the doctrine of presumed constitutionality of laws. So unless and until Supreme Court goes into the details of the case, finds the law to be ultra vires the Constitution, the law would be presumed to be constitutional until then. So the law, you can't stop this from coming into effect, right? That's why the Supreme Court has stayed only few provisions, allowing for the rest of the law to be implemented. Because until the Supreme Court decides otherwise, this law will remain constitutional. because it has been passed by the parliament. Is that clear? Now, coming to my last point here, this matter brings up the most important debate on religious autonomy versus state regulation. On one hand, there is a need to protect the autonomy that religion should have. It could be any faith for that matter. On the other hand, the state has a legitimate right to regulate even some religious affairs. So, how do you strike a balance between the two? Because both are conflicting objectives. This is where we get some insights from the editorial and even from the column. You essentially have to ensure that the state's regulatory power in legitimate matters is protected. Now, don't you think it's the state's responsibility to prevent the misuse of religion, the misuse of religious laws? Don't you think it's the state's responsibility to prevent corruption? Right? So, states do have a legitimate interest in regulating few religious affairs. But at the same time, the autonomy, the independence which has to be granted to religious matters, religious affairs, is something that should be seen as sacrosanct, which should be protected from unnecessary state interference. That fine line has to be maintained. Now, for example, if you look at the Waqf Amendment Act, some provisions were absolutely necessary to regulate Waqf property better, to prevent its misuse. But at the same time, the government should not give so much powers to itself that it will step into the domain of one's private religious matters. That is where the line should be drawn. So, when such laws are being contemplated, it is better that the government takes everybody on board, the political opposition, the society, that consensus has to be built. That is what you need. See, state regulation is absolutely necessary to maintain transparency and accountability in governance. At the same time, protecting the fundamental rights which are guaranteed, protecting minority religious rights is equally important. So, in such cases, irrespective of which religion, the government should ensure that political and social consensus is built. It should not appear that the government is bulldozing its way to target a particular religion. The same principle should apply across all religions as well. Let's say there is a misuse of religious land or religious property, be it in any faith, be it in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Christianity, or in Islam. The state has to step in, apply the same principle, and show that equality, ensure there is no discrimination on religious lines, and bring political and social consensus. Take the opposition on board, take the society on board, take the community leaders on board, and build that consensus. Maybe complete consensus can never be achieved, right? That's too idealistic. But at least ensure that there is inclusive approach when you're drafting such laws, when you're giving such powers to the state. That is something which should be kept in mind when state regulation is aimed at religious matters. It is important to maintain that subtle distinction between religious autonomy and state regulation, and one should not step into the domain of the other while a fine balance is being maintained. So this is what we take away from this important topic. I hope it's clearly understood. Now take up this mains practice question. What is the Waqf Amendment Act 2025? On what grounds was the law challenged? Which provisions did the court uphold? And on which did it impose a stay? What are the broader implications for minority rights? Now, don't you think, based on what we have discussed, you can write a good answer for this question? So you can start out by explaining in the introduction the purpose of the Waqf Amendment Act. Or the other option is you explain what is a Waqf property. A quick brief explanation of what is Waqf property and the rights of religious minorities in the country, the freedom of religion, and the rights of religious minorities as per the constitution. So that can also be a good introduction, a more conceptual and a more factual introduction. Or you can set the context based on the current developments in the context of the Amendment Act which was passed with the parliament. Then in the body, list out the provisions where the legal challenge was raised. What was the interpretation of the Supreme Court? Did Supreme Court uphold the provision or put a stay on the provision? So break down these points and then you conclude your answer. In the conclusion, you have to strike that balance, as I told you, a balance between the right of the state to regulate certain religious matters, on the other hand, protection of religious autonomy. So, this is the debate that you need to bring out and express your view about religious autonomy versus state regulation. 100% state regulation is needed in some matters to prevent the misuse of the laws, misuse of religious practices. That can't be allowed. But you have to mention that they should apply equally. The principle should apply equally for every religion, right? At the same time, state should not step into private religious matters. So this has to be the broader conclusion that you draw as you bring this answer to an end. So let's move on to the next topic. On page 7, there's a very interesting article. The article focuses on the role of technology in governance, how technology can transform government welfare and the delivery of public services, how it can inhibit the delivery of government services as well. It's like a two-sided coin, a double-edged sword. As you have heard, you might have heard regularly that technology is a great enabler. It creates a level playing field. It brings more efficiency. It brings transparency in governance. It helps tackle corruption. At the same time, the same technology can create problems, new challenges, and it could become a new divide, a technological divide, a digital divide, which could basically prevent the beneficiaries from accessing government welfare. It could become an inhibitor for governance as well, for good governance. So, how is this possible? Let's understand this with the help of an example. The writers here in this article are focused upon the Anganwadi centers. Have you heard of Anganwadi centers? They were first established in 1975 under the Integrated Child Development Scheme, the ICDS. ICDS has been a pivotal welfare program of India that focuses on child nutrition, a child's early learning, what we often refer to as a preschool, and as well as on maternal nutrition and maternal health. This is the primary focus of a Anganwadi center. In the country today, there are 1.4 million Anganwadi centers. Understood? They were set up in 1975, and under the ICDS program, they have been playing a pivotal role in delivering essential nutrition for children, pregnant, and lactating women. These centers have been playing a key role in promoting the health of pregnant women and lactating mothers. It also plays a key role in the healthcare of children under the age of 3 years and early childhood education, that is preschool learning. So this is the pivotal role performed by these Anganwadi centers. Now, recently, the government has rolled out a technological platform when it comes to the delivery of rations to the children and the mothers. Since Anganwadi centers are responsible for dispersing food material, right, to take care of the nutritional requirements of a child and the mother, pregnant, lactating mothers, these centers are distributing rations which are approved by the government to ensure that the food aid or the food supply which is delivered through this scheme, through this initiative, is not diverted or it's not delivered to the wrong beneficiaries or it's not misused. The government has introduced a technological uh, verification system of sorts, which has started creating new types of problems. See, these Anganwadi centers are run by Anganwadi workers. In each center, there has to be at least one Anganwadi worker who's trained and one helper. That's the minimum requirement. Now, these Anganwadi workers, let's call them AWs, and their helpers, they are supposed to use a digital tracker, a portion tracker. It's an application that the ministry has developed, the Ministry of Women and Child Development, in collaboration with the other concerned ministries. Through this app, the delivery of the ration is tracked to which child, to which pregnant lactating woman the rations are delivered. This is completely tracked through the app. It is verified, authenticated through the app. Now, this is a great way of preventing diversion of food grains and the food supplies and the nutritional requirements which are being provided. What if wrong beneficiaries, a woman who's not pregnant, is availing the benefits? What if the Anganwadi worker is corrupt and channeling the food rations towards the other community members instead of delivering this to the children and the pregnant lactating women? So to prevent such corrupt practices, to prevent the diversion, a technological tool can be a great enabler. So on the portion tracker, all the details have to be logged, and more importantly, before the rations are handed over, facial recognition software is deployed. On this app, there is a facial recognition software which has been integrated. The Anganwadi worker has to basically do a quick facial scan of the woman beneficiary to verify whether this is the right beneficiary or not. So if the facial recognition doesn't recognize the beneficiary, then the Anganwadi worker cannot provide the rations. So this is all tracked and the data is centralized. But however, the same tool could become an inhibitor. Because see, please understand the practical problems in implementing such technological solutions. Now, do you really think such a heavy application that requires significant processing abilities and high speed data, would it run smoothly on the basic mobile phone which is owned by a Anganwadi worker? By the way, government is not giving them any mobile phones. They're not being given any latest gadgets. No, Anganwadi workers have to use whatever phones they have. So given the processing capability of these phones, they can't run the app at the best optimal speed, or internet connection might be very patchy in rural areas, in remote areas. The performance of these mobile devices may not be appropriate. The facial recognition, if it fails, Anganwadi worker cannot give the ration to the pregnant lactating woman. Now, even if it's a genuine beneficiary, usually see in most cases, Anganwadi workers are from local community. They often know the local community members, so they definitely they are related, or at least they know the pregnant woman. Though they recognize them, they can't give out the rations unless and until the authentication is done. There is also a OTP based authentication as well. Apart from facial recognition of the right beneficiary, a OTP is delivered to the beneficiary's mobile number. Now think about this. In rural areas, though women do have mobile phones, sometimes they may not carry the mobile phones with them. In very patriarchal households, women are not allowed to keep mobile phones with them. So they may not receive the OTP. Just because they couldn't share the OTP, they'll be denied the rations. So this is where technology, though it's a great enabler, though it can actually bring about good governance, it can become an inhibitor as well because of these practical problems on the ground. That is why the writers are raising this concern that government should contemplate these ground realities before driving technological innovation in delivery of public services and in delivery of welfare programs. So let me know what you think about this in the comment section and take up this practice question. Examine how technology in governance can be an enabler as well as an inhibitor. Now let's move on to the other articles in today's paper. There are some very interesting articles relevant for prelims and mains. Let's go through them quickly. On the front page, we have an article that refers to the observation of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has asked the government, specifically the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, as to why can't we have a jail term for those who burn stubble. As you're all aware, stubble burning is a major environmental hazard, particularly in northern, northwestern parts of India, especially during the winter season. Large scale stubble burning by farmers in Punjab, by farmers in Haryana, even in parts of western UP, Delhi, NCR region. Large scale stubble burning releases a lot of particulate matter, which pollutes the air, which is responsible for the deadly smog conditions that you see in the Delhi NCR region. Correct? So stubble burning is the one of the root problems here, apart from the unique climatic and weather patterns of northern northwestern parts of India. There are many factors which play a role. Even industrial pollution, vehicular pollution plays a role. But stubble burning is one of the key contributors to the deadly smog in Delhi and in the northern northwestern parts of India. The Supreme Court of India has asked the government, why don't you jail these farmers? Why don't you make an example out of them so that others will also follow this? Because though stubble burning is banned, it's not being enforced on the ground by the state governments. They're not tackling it. There's no disincentive on the farmers, and they continue this practice because it is easier for small marginal farmers to basically set fire to the entire field to clear the stubble left after the harvest instead of manually clearing it. Because, see, first of all, they have very short time available to prepare the field for the next cropping cycle. Plus, they have to hire manual labor, pay wages to them to get the stubble removed, which is expensive and time consuming. So, easier way for farmers is to set the field on fire, burn the stubble completely. But this practice is extremely harmful, hazardous to the environment, causing air pollution, deadly smoke condition, contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. The Supreme Court is asking the government, why don't you make an example out of some of these farmers and take them for criminal prosecution, jail them, and push criminal prosecution on some of them so that others will learn a lesson. Set an example. But the government has said it's not feasible. The government has replied to the Supreme Court that what you're suggesting is not feasible, it's not possible. Because, see, previously, criminal prosecution was possible. But under the Commission for Air Quality Management Act, this provision has been explicitly removed. The penal provision has been exempted. Farmers cannot be jailed and criminally prosecuted for burning stubble after the exemption that was granted under the Commission for Air Quality Management Act. Instead, farmers are being encouraged, they are being incentivized, awareness is being spread. These efforts are not yielding results. That's why the Supreme Court asked the government, why don't you jail some of them, set an example, make an example out of them. So, when the government said this is not practical, the Supreme Court raised a very interesting question. By the way, this bench was also headed by Chief Justice of India, B.R. Gavai. So, the CJI has asked the government, are you worried about vote bank politics? Is this because of vote bank politics that you don't want to antagonize farmers, particularly in the Punjab Haryana belt? Because every 5 years there's an election cycle which comes up. So is the government worried that if you arrest farmers, it will create a backlash and farmers will not vote for the incumbent government, for the ruling party? The government has defended itself, saying this is nothing. This has nothing to do with elections. It's not about vote bank politics. But the Supreme Court has raised this question: are you worried about losing votes? If that is the case, keep these concerns aside and implement this as a one-off measure where you jail few farmers, prosecute them, set an example so others will not do it, others will not repeat this. Supreme Court has said carrot and stick policy is needed. You should not only incentivize farmers, you should disincentivize them as well through penalties, and that should include criminal penalization as per the Supreme Court. But the center has said no, it's not possible. So this is what you need to take away from this development. Next, on page 10, there's a very important update on India's ties with European Union. India EU are looking to further elevate the relationship. We already have a strategic partnership with European Union. The EU is a key partner, and the EU looks at India as a very important partner in the Indian Ocean and in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, experts believe this to be one of the most defining partnerships of the century. The European market is very crucial for Indian exports, especially after Trump's tariffs on Indian exports to the US. And Europe is a big source of investments into India. India also provides investments into Europe. India is a provider of essential goods, services, even labor and manpower, which is much needed in European countries. So there's a very close trade relationship, cultural relationship, and also significant technology partnership, defense partnership, and security alignment. So India EU are looking to take this relationship to the next level, and they're looking to further upgrade the strategic partnership. So several rounds of talks are taking place between top diplomats and officials on both sides. And recently, the EU diplomats who met with Indian negotiators, they have agreed to finalize the trade agreement as soon as possible. There is a FTA which is being negotiated between India and EU, the Broad-Based Trade and Investment Agreement, the BTIA. It's one of the long pending agreements. The negotiations for BTIA started way back in 2007. Even now, they have not been able to come to a common agreement. The negotiations had stopped in 2012. It was recently resumed, restarted in 2021. Since then, the talks are continuing, but still there has not been a breakthrough. But there's a lot of expectation on both sides that maybe by the end of this year or early next year, we should have a FTA between India and European Union. See, there are fundamental differences when it comes to free trade because India is a developing nation, whereas EU countries are all developed, industrialized nations. Obviously, priorities are different, focus areas are different. For example, developed markets in the EU, they expect very high quality standards, hygiene and sanitary standards. Maybe this can't be met by producers in a developing country like India. Now, take, for example, agricultural commodities or pharmaceutical products, right? Or products in the food industry. It is very hard to expect Indian producers to match those quality, hygiene, and sanitary standards, which are required in a developed market like the European market. So they create a trade barrier. They won't allow such inferior goods to pass into the European market. And if Indian producers try to inculcate those standards, they will incur significant expenses and they'll be driven out of competition. Also, these countries, they want greater market access into India. They want India to eliminate the tariff barriers and give free and better access to European companies, from pharmaceuticals to textiles to even automobiles to agriculture. So this could directly hit our small, medium, micro enterprises, our agriculture sector. So India has a very high tariff barrier in this regard. Even with regard to intellectual property rights, how IP laws are enforced. A developing nation like India can't go for a very strict, rigid implementation, whereas developed countries expect a very strict protection of IP laws. Then, even with regard to environmental standards, labor standards, and competition laws, there is no harmony between Indian regulation and European regulation. European regulatory standards are much higher compared to Indian regulatory standards. So this mismatch is what creates a difference, and we are not able to come to a common point. But there is hope on both sides that very quickly, in the next few months, we should be able to resolve these issues, and there should be a free trade agreement. So this will drive further trade and investments. There's a lot of technological collaboration happening between the two sides as well, in the domain of nuclear energy, space cooperation, even in the field of cutting edge research, in the field of critical emerging technologies, including AI, in the hunt for critical strategic minerals. All these are priority areas for both the sides. Then coming to defense, security, strategic ties, we are natural partners when it comes to counterterrorism or when it comes to uh, ensuring there is a rules based order which is maintained to ensure big powers don't trample upon the international rules which are put in place. But this is where India EU have a differing viewpoint when it comes to Russia. The European countries look at Russia as an imminent threat because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is understandable from their viewpoint. But India has maintained its close ties with Russia. India has not only been one of the largest buyers of Russian oil, but more recently, India participated in the Zapad military exercise that was organized by Russia with Belarus. This has raised alarm in Europe. The EU countries are alarmed that India participated in the Zapad military exercises. Remember, just a few days ago, I explained the Zapad military exercise between Russia and Belarus, and India was also one of the participants. The Zapad exercises were directly aimed at the West, aimed at NATO. So European countries are shocked as to what message India is sending by participating in the Zapad military exercises. But thinking in Europe is that, especially in Brussels, where European Union is headquartered, the thinking over there is that they should cultivate India. They can't abandon India. If they target India like Trump has done, then India will be pushed into the hands of Russia and maybe eventually into the hands of China as well. As India, China have now normalized their ties as both face a common threat from Trump's US. So European Union doesn't want to commit the same mistake. They don't want to cut off ties and get hostile against India because that would push India into the arms of Russia. So they want to cultivate India, build closer trade, defense, and technology ties so that they can try to pull India away from Russia. But India would like to maintain its autonomy. It would like to maintain its policy of multi alignment, where we work with Russia, where we work with Western countries as well. So, this is a very interesting phase that you see in the world order. So, in this regard, always keep track of India EU relations. There's going to be a lot of developments in the coming days. Next, the Election Commission has announced some big changes with regard to the EVMs and the ballot papers which are printed and attached to the EVM machines. In the upcoming Bihar elections, this will be tried out. So, under rule number 49B of the Conduct of Election Rules 1961, this rule specifically deals with the design and printing of the EVM ballot papers. If you have cast your vote, when you see the EVM machine, don't you see the ballot paper here, which has the list of all the contesting candidates with their party names and party symbol? Next to that, you have the button that you press, and the LED next to it will glow. Right? This is the basic design of your EVM. So, this piece of paper which is attached, which contains the serial numbers, the list of the candidates, their political parties, and the political party symbol, this is nothing but the ballot paper. Now, how it will be designed, how it will be printed, plays a big role in elections. Now, don't you think the names should be clearly legible? The party symbol, the photo of the candidate. Have you noticed on the ballot paper there is a photo, but until now it was a black and white photo of a very low resolution. You couldn't even see that there was a photo over there. So now, to ensure visibility, provide more clarity to the voters, the Election Commission has decided to publish color photos of the candidates. And two-thirds of the space allocated here, right, would be essentially given for the face of the candidate. Almost up to three-fourths of the space in the picture that is added here would be assigned for the face of the candidate so that voters can visually recognize the candidate who's contesting, to whom they want to cast their vote. Even the font size, the design of the font, everything is being revised for greater visibility, for easy clarity for the voters, so they don't cast a wrong vote. Understood? So, under the conduct of election rules, Election Commission has this authority to make these changes, and you will get to see these changes in the upcoming Bihar elections. Next, there's an article related to the poaching of tigers. The tiger poaching has always been a concern, but India has done very well to bring down the incidents of poaching of tigers. The National Tiger Conservation Authority, under Project Tiger, has done a phenomenal job of not just protecting the tiger habitats, the tiger reserves, but also to protect the tiger population as well. But in recent years, there is a rising concern, especially in central India, in Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh. Both the states, by the way, have some critical habitats and corridors for tigers. There are important tiger reserves in these two states, important tiger migratory corridors as well. So, in central parts of India, particularly in this tiger belt of Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, poaching incidents have risen quite significantly. And investigations have established a link with cross border smuggling, cross border trafficking, that is wildlife trafficking, where the body parts of the tiger is essentially being trafficked into Southeast Asian countries where there is a big market, a black market for wildlife trafficking, especially in Myanmar, in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand. There's a lot of demand for the parts of a tiger. It could be the tiger's teeth, claws, the bone, or the skin, even tiger hair is highly valued. It is also used in a lot of traditional quack medicine, Chinese medicine as well. There's a lot of superstition attached to it that it can cure many diseases and conditions, right? Some even believe it to be a aphrodisiac. So in Southeast Asia, in the black markets, What they do is they take tiger bones, they boil it using pressure cooking technique to produce a glue known as bone glue. This has a lot of value in the black market. They basically pressure cook the tiger bones to produce this bone glue. The bones are almost melted down with the marrow and everything. And the bone glue goes into the making of several artifacts, traditional medicine, and even food items which are consumed. So there's a lot of myth, superstition in these parts of Southeast and East Asia that this has curative medical properties as well. So tackling this menace has become a serious challenge for India because see, India has 70% of the global tiger population, correct? That's why the Supreme Court has stepped in and it has asked the government to hand over the investigation of these cases to the CBI because state police do not have the resources to crack down on such a transnational criminal syndicate. So such networks are run by criminal mafias, which are organized criminal networks. State police alone won't be able to tackle them as there are trans-border linkages with Myanmar and Southeast Asian countries. That's why the Supreme Court is pushing the government to hand over the probe of these incidents of tiger poaching to the CBI itself. But the government is saying there's no need for it. The Wildlife Crime Control Bureau will be able to handle these investigations. Now, what is the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau? Please make a note for your prelims, very important. It was established in 2007 under the provisions of Wildlife Protection Act. The Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 was amended through the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act in 2006, following which in 2007, this statutory body was set up. The Wildlife Crime Control Bureau. It's responsible to investigate, to carry out criminal investigation of cases of hunting and poaching, and to deal with any case of wildlife crimes which are being committed. So please make a note of this nodal agency of the government of India to tackle wildlife crimes. Now, looking at the next article, this is again related to upcoming FTAs. As I told you, India is negotiating an FTA with European Union. We're also negotiating FTAs with many others. We have an upcoming FTA with Australia in the coming years, a full-fledged FTA. Right now, we have a limited trade agreement. So we want to have a full-fledged FTA with Australia. Then we are in the process of negotiating FTAs with South American countries like Chile, Peru, and the others. But one highly anticipated FTA is with a grouping, economic grouping, a customs union known as Eurasian Economic Union, the EAEU. This is a Russia-led trade bloc. The Russia-led trade bloc, a customs union with which India has very close relations and linkages. So by November, it's expected that India and EAEU countries are expected to start their first round of talks to put in place a free trade agreement. Is that clear? So it's being reported that India will begin talks with this trade bloc led by Russia, the Eurasian Economic Union. That is the development. So what is this Eurasian Economic Union? Please make a note, very important for prelims, even for mains as well. This grouping was started in 2014 under the leadership of Russia. See, ever since the disintegration of Soviet Union in 1991, the Kremlin has always desired to bring back the Soviet glory, especially under leaders like Putin. Right? They are seen as revivalists. They want to revive that glory of the Soviet Union, the might and the reach of the Soviet Union. So one of Putin's attempt has been to rebuild the trade and the economic exchange in the region to establish Russian economic influence to counter the West. So when Western powers were pushing eastwards, when European Union and NATO were expanding eastwards through the 90s and early 2000, Russia naturally felt threatened because in the late 90s and early 2000, both EU and NATO added many member countries from Central Eastern Europe, including some former Soviet republics. Countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic states, they joined both EU and NATO. Countries like Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, they all ended up joining EU and NATO. So Russia has always seen the eastward expansion of these Western organizations as a threat. So Russia tried to counter this by setting up a counter trade bloc to counter the European Union, and it brought its close allies together. So it founded this trade bloc with Belarus and Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan from Central Asia, Belarus from Eastern Europe. So all three were part of the USSR. And under Russia's leadership, Russia, which is the successor to the USSR, this new trade bloc was envisioned. And trust me, this is connected to the Ukraine war. How? Russia very badly, desperately wanted Ukraine to join this trade bloc. But this did not happen because in Ukraine, there was a revolution by then. Until then, there was a pro Russian government and a leader who was toppled, which is also referred to as the Maidan Revolution, the Orange Revolution, allegedly sponsored by Western intelligence agencies. This pro Russian leadership was toppled, and a pro Western, pro US, pro European leadership took root in Ukraine. And Ukraine boycotted the Eurasian Economic Union. So when Ukraine did not join the trade bloc, Russia was furious. Putin was furious. In fact, this is what pushed Russia to annex Crimea in 2014. All these events are interconnected, right? So now the group has expanded over the years. Other countries also have joined. Kyrgyzstan has joined. Armenia has joined. So all these former Soviet republics are part of this trade bloc. India has a great working relationship with all of them, right? We have very good ties with Kazakhstan, Belarus, Armenia, of course, Russia, and even Kyrgyzstan. So now India is contemplating a FTA with them, and the talks are likely to begin by the end of this year. Next, on page 14, we have an article related to a development in Maldives. So just take a note. It's a development that you should be aware of. The Maldivian parliament, the People's Majlis, has recently enacted a law to regulate the media in the country. The erstwhile media regulatory body is being replaced by a new regulatory entity which can regulate all forms of media, newspapers, television, online media platforms. But this law has triggered a lot of concern that is the government trying to stifle the freedom of press? Is the government trying to restrict the right to free speech and expression? This issue has cropped up because, see, in Maldives, there is a struggle going on for many years, a struggle to control the narrative. There is one narrative which is pro India, there is one narrative which is anti India. So, behind the anti India narrative, there are few vested interests involved. The speculation or the allegations indicate few Pakistani elements, Chinese elements, American elements as well involved in trying to push a anti-India narrative to cut Indian influence in the Indian Ocean. At the same time, there has been a pro-India narrative as well. A section of media, a section of influencers and content creators in Maldives who are always pro-India. Now, we saw this tussle during the recent elections in 2024 when Mohammad Muizu was elected. Mohammad Muizu came to power primarily on an anti-India campaign, right? By essentially politicizing the presence of Indian military troops, by pushing for India out campaign. This media narrative, which was set during the election period, is what allowed Mohammad Muizu to be elected. This again shows the power of the media, the power of narrative control. So I'm trying to indicate that there is a larger geopolitical game involved here in controlling the media and the online platforms of Maldives, involving the stakeholders, that is India, China, Pakistan, US, could be others as well. So the Maldivian government has contemplated this law to better regulate the media platforms, but this is generating a backlash. Because see, Maldives has internal trouble as well. Its economy has been stagnant. There has been joblessness with regard to the youth. Inflation has been rising up. The debt, the foreign debt of Maldives has jumped up, and India is the one which has come to the rescue. India has provided a lot of financial support and liquidity arrangements to essentially help Maldives to stay afloat. So, in the midst of this geopolitical and economic crisis, this new law to regulate media has been projected as an attempt to control the narrative, and it is generating a lot of protests against the government. Now, the reason why we should be aware of these developments is because we have all seen what happened in Nepal, right? How resentment against the government can quickly spill over into violent protests, even leading to regime change. And this could even be exploited by outside powers, right? So that's why such internal developments of our neighboring countries is relevant for us. I mean, you should be aware of it. You should keep a watch on it. Next, India has announced a lot of upcoming projects with Venezuela. Some pilot projects are going to be tried out. One of the top leaders of Venezuela recently visited India, the Vice Minister for Development of Information and Communication. So, this leader of the Venezuelan government was in India, and both countries have signed some new agreements, new initiatives are being launched. India will be helping Venezuela in training programs to train its bureaucrats, diplomats, and as well as IT workforce. So, India would play a role in capacity building. Then India would be collaborating with Venezuela in the field of AI technologies, space cooperation, pharmaceuticals, and will be further stepping up our economic ties. Now, this is crucial because, see, right now tensions are rising between US and Venezuela. Donald Trump has accused Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro of being a drug trafficker. He has accused the Venezuelan government of smuggling narcotics into the US, and he has unleashed a war against the drug cartels, and he was even deployed US military assets. Multiple warships, fighter jets, drones have been deployed in the Caribbean Sea, and they have been launching these deadly missions, operations aimed at some of the so called drug cartels of Venezuela. Venezuela has rejected the allegations, and tensions are rising, and experts are even predicting a possible war, a possible conflict between the two countries. So it's interesting that India is now courting Venezuela at a time when Trump has essentially turned against India. See, previously we had followed American sanctions against Venezuela. Because don't forget, Venezuela has the world's largest known oil reserves. India has been procuring oil from Venezuela as well. But when Trump targeted Venezuela in the previous term, when he was the president for the first time, and sanctions were levied on the country, India had briefly stopped importing oil from Venezuela. But now maybe India is trying to leverage this. India is trying to diversify the relationship. Venezuela can be a reliable partner and supplier if India can assist the country because Venezuelan economy has crashed. It is dealing with massive inflation, lack of growth, joblessness. So there is a lot of economic volatility, and India can be the right partner to help in capacity building, training, or help in key sectors like pharmaceuticals, technology, etc. And in return, maybe Venezuela can be a oil supplier to India. So maybe India is exploring these possibilities, just to keep US on the hook, just to have that leverage against the Trump administration. So that is something you need to watch out for. Now, coming to the prelim section, we have few small articles. Let's take a quick look at all of them. The CAG, Comptroller Auditor General, has launched a AI platform, a large language model, a generative AI model has been developed to assist the work of auditing accounts, to bring more efficiency in audit accounting. So this is one key development that you need to note down. Zaklia, the CAG is launching a generative AI LLM, which will help the auditors to generate documents, to match the records, to look for discrepancies, and ensure efficient and transparent audits are carried out. Is that clear? And the CAG has also launched the Connect portal, a digital portal to connect the auditors, where they can share the documents, make all the documents accessible and available. So these are technological initiatives by the CAG of India. Now, look at this important point. The CAG is a constitutional authority provided under Article 148 of the Indian Constitution. The CAG is seen as the guardian of the public purse. The father of the Indian Constitution, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, considered the CAG to be one of the most important institutions to maintain transparency and accountability. Right? Dr. Ambedkar considered the CAG as a bulwark of the Indian democracy, as the guardian of the public purse. Now, I'll give you a small assignment, a small homework. Can you read about the role, the functions of CAG, the appointment, the removal of CAG? There are provisions in the Constitution from Article 148 to 151 that deals with the CAG. So can you read about this and post the key points in the comment section? Please take this up as a homework. Coming to the next article, there is a small article here on page 12 that refers to the export of Hilsa fish to West Bengal from Bangladesh. The Hilsa fish is absolutely crucial in Bengali cuisine, in Bengali diet. It's a staple. If you're a Bengali, you know what I'm talking about. Delicious fish, which has a lot of cultural and even religious significance as well. For the upcoming Dasara, Navratri, Durga Puja season, Hilsa fish has massive demand. And on the Indian side, there's a shortage of Hilsa. So Bangladesh is the key supplier, the exporter. And Bangladesh has started the first batch of export of Hilsa for the upcoming festive season, right? The Durga Puja season. And the fish is transported through the border point, Petrapole border point. That is what I want you guys to note down. Petrapole is an important land border trading post. We have an integrated check post over here. There is a ICP. Integrated check posts have modern trading facilities. And on the other side, we have Benapole in Bangladesh. The Petrapole Benapole trading checkpost is one of the largest land border checkpoint in Asia. In the whole of Asia, the Petrapole Benapole land border checkpoint is one of the largest trading facility as far as land borders are concerned. So India has a ICP set up over here, which is administered by the Land Ports Authority of India under the Ministry of Home Affairs. So please make a note of this border checkpoint. Coming to the last article. This year's Climate Change Summit, COP30, Conference of Parties 30, the 30th edition, will be held in Belém. And where is Belém? In Brazil. Don't get confused with Belém in Portugal, right? This is Belém in Brazil, which will play host to COP30 under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So countries are already divided when it comes to their climate action efforts. See, under the Paris Agreement of 2015, the countries had made a very big commitment to come out with their voluntary contributions, known as INDCs, intended nationally determined contributions. The countries were supposed to give voluntary commitments to bring down their consumption of fossil fuels, reduce emissions, and play a role in increasing the carbon sink so that we can limit the rise in global temperatures to under 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And if possible, to limit the global rise in temperatures to under 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was a much more ambitious target. So as per the NDCs, countries, all the UN member states have declared their NDCs for 5-year period, which is until 2030. But as per the Paris commitment, you are supposed to renew and update your target. You're supposed to report your performance on your voluntary commitments and also review and update your target for every 5 years. So now the time has come for countries to provide their revised updated targets, but some countries are hesitating. Usually European countries were seen as leaders. They were seen to be very proactive when it came to climate action efforts. But now that US and other big emitters are not showing much interest, European countries are also taking a back step. Even they want to hold back some of their commitments. See, otherwise, European countries were planning some ambitious goals. They want to achieve neutrality, carbon neutrality, net zero emissions by 2050. They want to bring down their emissions intensity by 90% by 2040. These are some ambitious targets which are being discussed by the EU. But some major powers in the EU are now taking a back step. France, Germany, which are the leaders of EU, they are taking it slow because they don't want to commit unnecessarily when the largest polluters like China, US, and others are not making equal commitments. So this again shows how divided the world is when it comes to climate action and climate change negotiations. So let's see what happens at COP30, but that is something you need to note down. So on this note, I bring my discussion to an end. I hope it's been a detailed and interesting analysis. And if you have liked and enjoyed the session, and if you've learned something, please let me know through your comments, press the like button, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.